When we hear the word grief, we think death. But grieving is not just about death. Grief can be global. Pandemics, racial injustice, climate change, war, poverty can be personal. The end of a marriage, an unexpected move, the loss of a friendship, job, or loved one. And as you watch me from your personal device, the same way you've taken part in so many meetings over the last few months, you realize it's very tangible in the workplace as well. We're in this together, but we're functionally apart. We are encountering experiences and emotions that many have never had to face before, and many of us have no idea what to do with these feelings. Because of the pandemic, businesses are confronting grief and loss at a vast scale, skyrocketing unemployment, employee disengagement, corporate restructuring, shifts in management, closing. And as individuals, we are encountering social isolation, community changes, lack of touch and hugs, and a shortage of toilet paper before, right? I hope that doesn't come back. We have a lot of crap to deal with on all levels, as it were. The future of work demands that we name grief for what it is and address its exponential rise right now. In her book, Rising Strong, Brené Brown calls grief the emotion we fear the most. We avoid it, we suppress it, we don't talk freely about it, hoping it'll just go away. In the workplace in particular, we acknowledge it only when it's convenient and not too disruptive. How's that been working? Right now, as grief is overcoming so many of us, we're struggling. It's time to right some wrongs about grief so that we can better support our colleagues, employees, and yes, ourselves. Hi, my name is Leslie Barber. I'm the founder and CEO of Grief Warrior, a company committed to reorienting grief in our culture, especially in our workplaces. I learned the hard way how intense grief is, and I experienced firsthand the lack of understanding we all have about grief. On June 21st, 2015, my husband Steve died. The summer solstice, the longest day of the year, became the worst day of my life. Cancer killed him at 46. At that time, I thought taking care of my husband and watching him die as cancer ravaged his body right before my eyes was as horrific as it could get. His death was an earthquake that uncontrollably shook my world, and I thought that at least the worst was over. But the quiet tsunami was stealthily swelling. After Steve died, the grief tsunami hit with a strength so intense, so ferocious, that I lost my footing. I felt like I was drowning, pummeled by debris in the form of well-intentioned platitudes that pulled me deeper down. When will you stop crying? They asked. I fell deeper. When will you be back to normal? When will you do the things that you used to be able to do? Everything got darker. Everything just and fair was gone. It has taken years for my body to heal, my heart to thaw, my mind to clear from that original tsunami, only to realize that grief waves stay with me. Like the tides, sometimes they are predictable, but sometimes they sneak up on me. About 6 months ago, I was clothes shopping. When I checked out, the cashier asked if she could email me my receipt. Of course, I said. She wanted to verify my email, but when she said the address, it was Steve's. In that instant, I just crumbled, engulfed in a grief wave. It was unexpected. And I know now that the grief waves will continue because my love for Steve remains. And that's okay. He was worth the occasional grief wave. Our love was worth it. The grief is worth it. This forever grief journey illuminated to me that everything I knew about grief was wrong. I want to share some of those wrongs with you. Our first wrong is that there are 5 stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed the stages for the dying process. She then adapted them for the loved ones of someone dying. They can be used as stages of anticipatory grief. She acknowledged, however, that they were never linear, never comprehensive, and never to be used for grief in their original forms. Our culture grabbed onto them because we want to fit messy into a list of boxes to check off. Grief doesn't play like that. We do not get over or move on from grief. We learn to swim in it. We learn to carry it forever. Our capacity to manage it grows as well as our ability to re-engage other emotions. At first, after this significant event, grief is all-encompassing. It completely takes over my brain, our brains. In deep early grief, the brain is working overtime to understand what has happened. I often spend time with many of my grief coaching clients just navigating what has transpired. They're overwhelmed just wrapping their minds around what has happened to them. When our brains are on overload like this, it's much harder to process anything else. It takes a huge amount of energy and brain power, which makes day-to-day work and functioning really challenging. Many describe the fogginess, the lack of clarity, the inability to find words, the forgetfulness. This is all part of grief. As time goes on, we gain more capacity for other emotions, but the grief wave may be just as ferocious as in the early days, and it's involuntary. We can't choose when grief waves come over us. Time does not heal the grief. It teaches us to live with the grief. And with time, we bring in more space for other emotions. Our second wrong is that grief is something you respect by not addressing. Sometimes we think that we're honoring the griever when we don't look them in the eye, when we ignore the grief, or don't mention it. We think we're being respectful by giving them a whole lot of space. I invite you to reframe how you think about honoring grief. In fact, the honoring is in the witnessing and the acknowledging. When you see someone grieving, you are seeing someone who has had their heart broken. You're witnessing pain. And contrary to our culture, good managers and leaders run toward the pain, not away from it. Good managers get messy, get their hands dirty when it comes to pain, because good managers know that to truly bring your whole self to work, we must bring all of ourselves, not just the joyous parts. When my team partners with organizations to deliver manager trainings on grief, this particular shift is paramount as employees come forward saying that they now feel seen or heard, that they belong and feel included because their managers acknowledge their grief. As leaders, we must acknowledge it, whether the grief is personal or collective, such as the grief we're feeling from the pandemic and from racial injustice. We must show up and listen. This is what honors grief and engages your employees and colleagues. Our third wrong is that grief is a problem to be solved. As managers, we were taught to solve the problem, fix the challenges for our employees, move the hurdle out of the way of the runners, right? Well, not with grief. As a supporter, we might think that if we give advice, try to cheer up or distract, it will make it easier for our grieving colleagues. The opposite is true. I hear repeatedly from my grieving clients that they immediately lose connection from their work family when their colleagues try to cheer them up while they're in deep grief. It feels so alienating and isolating to be told to stop hurting when you're in pain. And an effort to cheer up can do just this. Our right to this wrong is to focus on your role with the griever. You are an acknowledger. It is your job to meet your people where they are, not where you want them to be. It is also your job to create space for their emotions without comparison or competition. Acknowledge, acknowledge, acknowledge. And don't worry, I'm letting you off the hook. It's not your responsibility to fix the grief. Grief can't be fixed, but it is your responsibility to honor and address the real impact of grief on your colleagues and employees. Our fourth wrong is that bereavement leave is a time for grieving. Bereavement leave was given to employees originally to attend a funeral, at least before pandemic. 3 days, 1 to travel there, 1 day for the funeral, and 1 day to go home. 99% of companies do not give people any leave for grieving right now. I worked for a company that was always on the list of best places to work when Steve died, and yet he died on a Sunday, and I would have been expected back to work on Thursday. That's laughable. Our right to this wrong is a significant shift in our thinking about how we address grief in the workplace, like how we address birth in the workplace. Both are physiologically impactful. Both require time to heal and adjust. The growing of your family impacts similarly to the shrinking of your family. Right now, companies expect managers to handle grief on a case-by-case basis. Can you imagine if we were saying that about births? Well, just ask your manager if you can have time off for the delivery. Of course not. HR develops a policy that supports new parents and the company. The same should happen with grief. An equitable, fair policy should be put in place at every company to provide grief leave. We must support employees in the worst of times as fully as we support them in the best of times. The final wrong is the constant drumbeat of our culture that grief is something that happens to others. Except that would only be true if you refuse to love someone or something throughout your entire life. The difficult truth is that we are all going to die, which means that someone we love is also going to die. We all love something in our life, a job, a relationship, a home, and we will all experience something ending or changing. And these experiences will cause grief. The right to this wrong is simple. If you love, you will grieve. It is time to bring grief out of the shadows and call it what it actually is. Grief is love. It's not the other side of love or the receipt for love or our payment for love. Grief is love, period. Love doesn't end when someone dies. The love doesn't end when something meaningful to us ends. Love transforms into grief. And how much we grieve correlates to how much we love or didn't love. One of the most common grief experiences that I hear about in our management trainings is when a manager or coworker we love moves to a new role or leaves the company. We are generally told what? To put our heads down and to just keep working. But we're grieving that loss. How is that bringing our whole selves to work? Grief is about so much more than death. If you love planning and predictability, which has been wiped out by the pandemic, you will grieve. If you love your pet deeply and it dies, you will grieve deeply. If you love your community and you're forced to move, you will grieve. If you love your team and you are restructured out, you will grieve. You may have been told that COVID-19 would be over by now, and you may have believed and hoped for this to be true, because as a human, you love your freedom. COVID-19 is not over, and the trajectory of our pandemic, of this pandemic, is unknown. And that feeling you have now, all those emotions about this, that's grief. All of this is grief. Look, grief is a natural part of the human experience. The future of work requires that we think differently about how we address and include grief in the workplace, and also how we handle the grief waves that endure over time. Taking care of your employees in the best of times and the worst of times is the future of work. Grief is a reminder to love and to live, and honoring it will make our workplaces more inclusive and our employees more engaged. So what can you do next? I'm thrilled to share that Grief Warrior has launched a white paper on grief in the workplace. We have outlined ways that your company and managers can take actions to improve your organization for grieving employees. You can find the white paper on our website, agriefwarrior.com. It's time to reframe grief from a taboo topic to a universal source of connection. Thank you.